The gale came down from the north like the wrath of an ancient god, howling across the endless Dakota plains with a fury that could strip flesh from bone. Snow fell in blinding curtains, obscuring the world beyond 10 paces. The wind shrieked through skeletal cottonwoods, tearing at their branches and sending ice crystals slashing through the air like 1,000 tiny blades. Evangeline Rose clutched the leather satchel to her chest as though it were a child, her fingers numb inside worn gloves. Behind her, 5 children huddled together beneath a threadbare wool blanket, their faces pale with cold and terror. The youngest, a boy of perhaps 6 winters, whimpered softly, his breath coming in shallow gasps that formed fragile clouds in the frigid air. "Miss Rose," called Mary, the eldest girl, her voice barely audible over the storm's roar. "I can't feel my toes anymore." Evangeline turned her dark eyes fierce despite the exhaustion carved into her features. "Keep moving, Mary. All of you keep moving. We'll find shelter soon." It was a lie, and she knew it. They had been walking for hours through this merciless blizzard, fleeing from men with guns and cold hearts. The wagon had overturned 2 miles back when the horses panicked, spilling them into the drifts. She had managed to salvage the satchel, the most important thing, but little else. Inside that leather case were ledgers, columns of numbers, dates, names, evidence of theft, fraud, and murder stretching back 3 years. Evidence against Indian agent Silas Kensington, a man who held the power of life and death over hundreds of souls across the Dakota Territory. Evangeline had discovered the ledgers hidden in Kensington's office while delivering orphans to the Indian Agency for placement. She had seen the discrepancies, immediately rations promised, but never delivered medicine diluted or withheld entirely. Funds meant for schools diverted into private accounts. And the children, oh God, the children sold off like livestock to work farms and mines. May their names erased from official records as if they had never existed. She had taken the ledgers and run, gathering the 5 children under her care and fleeing into the wilderness. Kensington's men had pursued within the hour. Now the storm pressed down upon them like a living thing, an implacable third enemy more deadly than any bullet. Evangeline could no longer see the trail. The world had become nothing but white fury and screaming wind that tore at her cloak and threatened to knock the children from their feet. Then through the veil of snow, she saw movement. Figures on horseback, barely visible ghosts in the blizzard. Her heart seized. Kensington's men, but no. These riders moved differently, their shapes bundled in furs and hides, sitting their horses with a different posture. One of them raised a hand signaling. A voice called out in Lakota, then in accented English, "You will die if you stay out here." Evangeline hesitated, every instinct screaming caution. But when she looked back at the children, their lips blue, their eyes glassy with the first stages of hypothermia, she knew there was no choice. "Please," she shouted into the wind, her voice cracking. "Help us." The lead rider dismounted and approached. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by a fur-lined hood. His eyes dark and assessing swept over her and the children with a practiced evaluation that suggested both warrior and protector. "You are far from any road," he said, his English careful and deliberate. "Why are you out here?" "We're running," Evangeline said simply. There was no point in lying. "From dangerous men." The rider studied her for a long moment, his gaze lingering on the satchel she clutched so protectively, then nodded. "My name is Chask. We have a winter camp nearby. Come with us, or the storm will take you." He turned without waiting for an answer, lifting the smallest child onto his horse with surprising gentleness. The other riders dismounted, each taking a child with practiced efficiency. One offered Evangeline his horse, speaking soft words in Lakota that sounded like reassurance. As they moved through the blizzard, following Chaske's lead through the howling white hell, Evangeline clutched the satchel tighter. She did not know if she had found salvation or walked into a different kind of danger. But behind them, somewhere in that shrieking wilderness, Kensington's men were still searching. And she knew with cold certainty that they would not stop until she was dead and the ledgers burned to ash. The Lakota winter camp sat in a sheltered hollow, protected from the worst of the wind by a horseshoe of low hills and dense stands of pine. A dozen lodges stood in a loose circle, their hides pulled taut over sturdy frames, smoke rising from central fires despite the storm's fury. The sight of them, solid, real, alive, brought tears to Evangeline's frozen cheeks. Chaske led them to one of the larger lodges and helped the children inside, where warmth and the smell of burning cedar enveloped them like an embrace. Women appeared with blankets and bowls of hot broth, speaking softly in Lakota and broken English. The children were wrapped, fed their frostbitten fingers, and toes, carefully tended with snow, rubbed gently on the afflicted areas to restore circulation. Evangeline sat near the fire, still clutching her satchel. Only when a woman gently pried it from her hands did she realize how tightly she had been gripping it, her fingers locked in a death grip. She looked up, startled, but the woman, middle-aged, with kind eyes and a single streak of white through her dark hair, simply set the satchel beside Evangeline and handed her a cup of broth. "Drink," the woman said in English. "You are safe now." "Thank you," Evangeline whispered, her voice raw from screaming against the wind. "Thank you so much." Chaske entered the lodge a moment later, shaking snow from his furs and stamping his boots. He crouched beside the fire, his expression unreadable. Now that she could see him clearly, Evangeline noted the strength in his features, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, eyes that carried both intelligence and deep sorrow. There were lines around his mouth that spoke of grief held carefully in check. "The storm will last several days," he said without preamble. "You and the children will stay with us until it passes." Evangeline nodded, relief flooding through her. "We're grateful. I'm Evangeline Rose. I was a matron with the Orphan Train Society, escorting these children west." "And the dangerous men you spoke of?" Chaske asked quietly, his eyes never leaving her face. She hesitated, then decided on the truth. Lies would only endanger these people further. "Indian agent Silas Kensington. I have evidence of his crimes, theft, fraud, and worse. When I discovered it, I ran. His men have been hunting us for 2 days." Chaske's expression darkened like a thundercloud rolling across summer plains. "Kensington." The woman who had offered broth, introduced as Chenoa, one of the band's respected elders, leaned forward, her face hardening. "That man is poison. He withholds our rations, sells them for profit in Yankton. Our children go hungry while he grows fat on beef and whiskey." "It's worse than that," Evangeline said quietly. She retrieved the satchel, opening it to reveal the 3 leather-bound ledgers inside. "These are his account books. They detail everything: funds, embezzled medicine, replaced with colored water children, sold to work camps and worse places. I didn't know the full extent until I started reading them." Chaske reached for one of the ledgers, then paused, his hand hovering. "I cannot read English well," he admitted, and there was no shame in his voice, only frustration. "I can read them to you," Evangeline offered. "But you should know, if Kensington's men find me here, they'll burn this camp to ash to retrieve these books. I won't let that happen. As soon as the storm breaks, I'll leave." "No." Chaske's voice was firm, brooking no argument. "If what you say is true, then this evidence must reach the territorial court. We will protect you." Chenoa nodded, her weathered face resolute. "The children need rest. You need rest. When the storm passes, we will decide together what must be done." Evangeline wanted to argue, but exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. The warmth of the fire, the safety of the lodge, the knowledge that at least for this moment, the children were not in immediate danger. It was too much. Her eyes closed despite her best efforts to stay vigilant. When she woke hours later, it was to the sound of voices speaking Lakota in hushed, urgent tones. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake the children sleeping nearby, wrapped in borrowed furs and breathing peacefully for the first time in days. Chaske stood near the lodge entrance with two other men, their expressions grim. He noticed her stirring and approached. "Our scouts report riders circling the area. They are searching, but the storm hides us for now." Evangeline's heart sank. Kensington's men, most likely. Chaske's jaw tightened. "When the storm ends, they will find us." "Then I should go," Evangeline said, rising despite the protest of her exhausted body. "I'll lead them away." "No." Chaske's hand on her shoulder was gentle but unyielding. "You would die within an hour. And even if you survived, they would still come here searching for you. We will find another way." Evangeline looked into his eyes and saw something that surprised her, not just determination, but a personal rage barely held in check, like coals banked beneath ash. "Kensington killed my family," Chaske said quietly, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "Last winter, smallpox came to our band. He promised vaccine, charged us dearly for it. 20 good horses, all our furs from the autumn hunt. My wife, my daughter, my son, they all received it." His voice cracked slightly. "They all died anyway, screaming in fever while their skin erupted in sores. I learned later from a traveling doctor that the vaccine had been diluted, cut with water and colored dye. Worthless." Evangeline felt tears burn her eyes. "I'm so sorry. If your ledgers prove what he did, then I will help you bring them to court," Chaske said, and now his voice was steel, wrapped in quiet fury. "Not just for you, for all of us. For every life he has destroyed in the name of profit." Evangeline nodded, unable to speak, past the lump in her throat. Around them the storm howled on a wall of white fury, separating them from the hunters drawing ever closer. The blizzard raged for 5 full days. During that time, Evangeline and Chaske sat together each evening, going through the ledgers, page by page. She read aloud in the firelight, while he listened, his expression growing darker with each entry, his hands occasionally clenching into fists before he forced them to relax. The numbers told a story of calculated cruelty. Kensington had been skimming funds for years, but it was the entries from the previous winter that struck like hammer blows. November 12th, 1853. Smallpox vaccine, 200 doses, ordered from St. Louis at $2.50 per dose. Total $500. Actual received 50 doses. Diluted 4:1 with distilled water and aniline dye, cost $3.80. Sold to Indian bands at original price. Cost savings $340. December 20th, 1853. Mortality rate among vaccinated population 67%. Acceptable losses given profit margin. Chaske's hands shook as Evangeline read those words. Chenoa, sitting nearby mending a torn shirt, closed her eyes and murmured a prayer in Lakota. "Acceptable losses." Chaske repeated, his voice hollow. "My daughter was 7 years old. Her name was Winona. She loved to sing. She would make up songs about the birds, the clouds, everything she saw." He looked at Evangeline, and she saw the grief and rage warring in his eyes. She was an acceptable loss to him. Evangeline reached out, instinctively placing her hand over his. His skin was warm, calloused from years of hard work. "I'm so sorry. But this," she gestured to the ledgers, "this can bring him to justice. A federal judge will have no choice but to act when he sees this evidence." "Will they believe an Indian's testimony?" Chaske asked bitterly. "They'll believe the numbers," Evangeline said firmly. And they'll believe me. I was an employee of the Orphan Train Society. I have legal standing to testify in territorial court. One of the younger men, Hinto, who had been sitting quietly in the corner repairing a broken saddle, spoke up in Lakota. Chasky translated. He asks if there is anything in those books about payments to band members. Evangeline frowned and flipped through the ledger, scanning the neat columns. Her eyes widened as she found a section labeled Informants and Cooperative Assets. Oh, God, she whispered. He's been paying people, scouts from various bands, to report on movements, on conflicts, on anything that might be useful to him. She looked up. There are several names here. I can't pronounce them, but... Chasky took the ledger, his jaw tight. He scanned the list, and his expression turned to stone. These men betrayed their own people for Kensington silver. Do you recognize any of them? Evangeline asked quietly. 2 are dead, killed in a skirmish with the Crow last spring. 1 left for Canada last year. Chasky paused, his finger stopping on a name. The others? I do not know. Some of these names are false, I think. Aliases. Hinto shifted uncomfortably near the lodge entrance, and Evangeline noticed just for a moment the way his eyes darted toward the ledger, then away, then back again. His hand stilled on the saddle he'd been repairing. But then the moment passed, and he was asking another question in Lakota, his voice carefully neutral. Chasky nodded. He asks if we will share this information with the council. We should, Evangeline said. Everyone deserves to know what Kensington has done. That night, the camp's council gathered in the largest lodge. Chasky presented the evidence, and Evangeline read key passages aloud, translated by Chenoa, for those who spoke no English. The room filled with anger, grief, and a rising determination. But outside, the storm finally began to ease. The wind's howl dropped to a moan, and the snow thinned from blinding sheets to scattered flurries. By morning, pale sunlight would break through the clouds. And on the morning of the 6th day, one of the scouts rode into camp with urgent news. A dozen armed riders were approaching from the east, less than 3 miles away. They carried torches and rifles. Kensington's posse had found them. Chaos erupted in the camp. Chasky immediately began organizing defenses, sending the women and youngest children to the far lodges, while positioning the men along the camp's perimeter, with what few rifles they possessed, mostly old trade muskets, that misfired as often as they fired, and a handful of Sharps rifles acquired through hard trading. Evangeline helped gather the 5 orphans, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Stay close to me, she told them, gripping Mary's shoulder. No matter what happens, stay close. Little Thomas, the youngest, clung to her skirt with both hands. Are the bad men coming, Miss Rose? Yes, sweetheart, she said, forcing calm into her voice, even as terror clawed at her chest. But these people are going to protect us. Mary, the eldest girl, looked pale but resolute. What can we do to help? Pray, Evangeline said simply. Pray very hard. Chasky returned, his expression grim, a Sharps rifle cradled in his arms and a powder horn slung across his chest. I am sending you the children and some of our elders across the Ash River. There is a cave system on the far side. You can hide there while we hold them off. And leave you to face them alone, Evangeline protested. No. This is not a debate. Chasky said, his voice hard. Then more gently, his eyes meeting hers. If they capture you, all of this is for nothing. The ledgers must survive. You must survive to testify. Evangeline wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. She nodded, gripping the satchel. Be careful. Something flickered in Chasky's eyes, an emotion she couldn't quite name, something deeper than mere concern for a witness. You as well. The evacuation began immediately. Evangeline, the 5 orphans, Chenoa, and 3 other elders were led by a young warrior named Maddo to the riverbank. The Ash River ran wide and fast here, its surface partially frozen but treacherous with chunks of ice grinding together and hidden currents that could pull a grown man under in seconds. The crossing is dangerous, Maddo explained, his breath fogging in the cold air. But there is a shallow ford half a mile upstream. We must hurry. They moved through the thinning snow, following the river's edge. Evangeline kept the children close her eyes, scanning the trees for any sign of Kensington's men. The morning was eerily quiet, except for the crunch of their boots in the snow and the distant grinding of ice. Then, without warning, a gunshot cracked through the cold air, sharp, definitive, echoing off the hills. Maddo crumpled blood blooming across his chest in a spreading crimson stain. He hit the snow and did not move his eyes, staring sightlessly at the gray sky. "Run!" Chenoa screamed, her voice high with terror. 3 riders burst from the tree line, their horses plunging through the drifts with explosive force. They wore heavy coats and carried revolvers, Kensington's hired guns, their faces hard and pitiless, the faces of men who had done this kind of work before. Evangeline grabbed Thomas and ran the other children, scattering in panic. The riverbank was slick with ice, and she nearly fell twice, barely catching herself. Behind her, she heard shouts, the thunder of hooves, another gunshot that sent splinters flying from a nearby tree. "Stop right there, lady!" One of the men yelled, his voice rough. Evangeline ignored him, her boots skidding on the frozen ground. The river loomed ahead, wide, dark, deadly. She could see chunks of ice drifting in the current, grinding together with low, ominous cracks that sounded like bones breaking. A bullet whined past her ear so close she felt the displacement of air. And then the ground simply ended. She had reached the riverbank, but the snow had hidden a steep drop. Evangeline's foot found nothing but air, and she pitched forward with a scream, Thomas still clutched in her arms. They hit the water hard. The cold was a physical blow that drove the air from her lungs, stealing her breath and sending shock waves of agony through her body. The current seized them immediately, dragging them downstream with terrifying speed. Evangeline fought to keep Thomas's head above water, her own lungs burning her wet dress, growing impossibly heavy and dragging her down like lead weights. She could hear the little boy gasping, see the terror in his wide eyes as he choked on river water. "Hold on." She choked out, her lips already numb. "Thomas, hold on to me." The river carried them swiftly, spinning them in eddies and slamming them against ice chunks with bruising force. Evangeline's fingers were numb, losing their grip. Her vision began to darken at the edges. "I'm going to die here," she thought with sudden crystalline clarity. "We're both going to die, and Kensington will burn those ledgers, and it will all have been for nothing." But then, impossibly strong hands grabbed her collar, hauling her upward with brutal efficiency. She gasped, coughing up river water that burned her throat, and found herself staring into Chaskey's fierce, determined eyes. He had ridden along the bank and plunged into the water after them, his horse struggling against the current, its eyes rolling white with fear. With one arm he held Evangeline. With the other, he gripped his mount's reins and mane. "Hold on," he roared over the rush of water. Evangeline wrapped her arms around him, feeling the solid strength of his body, and together they fought the river's pull. Thomas clung to her like a burr, sobbing but alive. After what felt like an eternity, her muscles screaming, her lungs burning, Chaskey's horse found purchase on the far bank and lunged upward, dragging them all from the water in a spray of ice and foam. They collapsed on the snowy ground, gasping and shaking. Evangeline could barely feel her limbs. Beside her, Thomas was frighteningly pale, his lips blue. Chaskey wasted no time. He pulled off his heavy fur coat and wrapped it around Thomas, then lifted the boy onto his horse. "The cave is close. Can you walk?" Evangeline nodded teeth, chattering too hard to speak. They stumbled through the snow, Chaske leading his horse with one hand and supporting Evangeline with the other. Behind them, across the river, they could hear shouts and gunfire. But the water had bought them precious time. When they finally reached the cave, a dark mouth in the hillside, half hidden by ice and overhanging rock, Chenoa and the other children were already there, frightened but safe. The older woman immediately set about building a small fire using dried moss and branches stored in the cave, her hands working with practiced efficiency despite their trembling. Evangeline sank down beside the growing flames, shaking violently. Chaske knelt beside her, his expression tight with concern, checking her for injuries with gentle, efficient hands. "You saved our lives," Evangeline whispered through chattering teeth. "Thank you." "You are brave," Chaske said quietly, his dark eyes holding hers. "Foolish, perhaps, but brave. Not many would have held on to that boy in the current." "I couldn't let him go," Evangeline said simply. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared purpose of survival against impossible odds of something deeper that neither was ready to name. Then Chaske rose. "I must return to camp. Kensington's men will not stop searching." "Be careful," Evangeline said, and was surprised by the depth of feeling in her own voice. Chaske nodded once, his hand lingering briefly on her shoulder, then disappeared back into the snow. For 2 days they sheltered in the cave, while the sounds of distant gunfire and shouting echoed across the valley. Chenoa rationed their meager supplies, dried venison pemmican, a small water skin, while Evangeline did her best to keep the children calm and warm. Thomas developed a cough from his ordeal in the river, a wet, rattling sound that terrified her. Evangeline held him close to the fire, whispering stories to distract him from his discomfort tales of brave children and happy endings that felt like lies in this cold darkness. "Miss Rose," Mary asked quietly on the second night, her young face drawn with worry, "will we ever be safe?" Evangeline looked at the girl's earnest, frightened face and forced a smile. "Yes, sweetheart. I promise you we will be safe." She only hoped it wasn't another lie. On the morning of the 3rd day, Chaske returned. His face was haggard, a fresh cut above his eye, still seeping blood, but he carried supplies, blankets, food, and crucially the leather satchel with the ledgers. "The camp held," he said, settling beside the fire, with a wince that suggested bruised ribs. "Kensington's men retreated after we killed 2 of them and wounded several others. But they have not left the area. They are waiting for reinforcements." "How many men does Kensington have?" Evangeline asked. "At least 20, perhaps more." Chaske's jaw tightened. "He has also sent word to Fort Randall claiming that a dangerous criminal has stolen government property and is hiding among hostile Indians. Soldiers may come." Evangeline felt cold dread settle in her stomach like a stone. "If the army believes him, then we will be slaughtered." Chaske looked at her steadily. "That is why we must act quickly. There is a federal marshal in Yankton 3 days' ride south. If we can reach him with the ledgers, Kensington's lies will be exposed." 3 days through hostile territory," Evangeline said slowly. "With Kensington's men hunting us." "Yes." Chenoa spoke up in Lakota, and Chaske translated, "She says a traveling doctor sometimes camps near the southern fork of the river. Dr. Laurent, a Frenchman who treats both white settlers and Lakota bands. If we can reach him, he may be able to help us. He knows the area well and has contacts at Fort Pierre." Evangeline considered this, weighing their limited options, then nodded. "When do we leave?" "Tonight," Chaske said, under cover of darkness. They set out after nightfall, Chaske, Evangeline, and two young warriors named Tashunka and Hinto. The children and elders remained in the cave under Chenoa's protection, well hidden and supplied with enough food for a week. Evangeline hated leaving them, but she knew it was necessary. The smaller the group, the faster they could move, and the greater their chance of success. They rode through the night, following game trails and frozen creek beds to avoid detection. The temperature plummeted and frost formed on their furs and the horses' manes, creating a glittering coat that caught the moonlight. Evangeline's fingers ached with cold despite her gloves, and she tucked them under her arms for warmth. Chaske rode beside her occasionally, pointing out landmarks or motioning for silence. When he heard something suspicious and the distant whinny of a horse, the crack of a branch, that might be a man or might be a deer, his presence was reassuring, solid, competent, utterly focused. Once, when they paused to rest the horses in a sheltered hollow, he handed her a strip of pemmican. Eat. You need strength. Thank you. Evangeline chewed the dried meat, slowly savoring the burst of energy it provided. After a moment, she asked, "Can I ask you something?" Chaske nodded, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Your wife and children, what were they like?" For a long moment he said nothing, his gaze distant. Then quietly, "Nyaha, my wife, was strong. She could shoot better than most men, and she feared nothing. She used to laugh at me when I worried too much." His voice softened. "Winona, my daughter, had her mother's laugh. And my son Chitan was only 2 winters old. He was just beginning to talk. His favorite word was Igmu, cat. We did not even have a cat, but he would point at everything and say it." Evangeline's throat tightened. "I'm so sorry for your loss." "And you?" Chaske asked, turning the question back. "Do you have family?" "No." Evangeline said softly, "My parents died of cholera when I was young. I barely remember them. I was raised in an orphanage in Boston, the Mercy Home for Girls. When I was old enough, I went to work for the Orphan Train Society, helping to place children in new homes out west." She smiled bitterly. "I thought I was doing good work. I didn't realize how many of those homes were really just labor camps or worse. How many children disappeared into mines and brothels." "You are doing good work now," Chaske said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. Their eyes met in the darkness, and Evangeline felt something warm unfurl in her chest, a fragile connection forged in shared grief and common purpose. Without thinking, she reached out and squeezed his hand. He squeezed back his grip, warm and strong. Then Hinto called out softly in Lakota from his position ahead, and the moment passed. Chaske rose, checking his rifle with practiced efficiency. "We should move." They found Dr. Laurent's camp at dawn the next day, a canvas tent pitched beside a frozen stream, with a small fire smoldering outside and the sharp smell of coffee in the cold air. The doctor himself, a wiry man in his 50s, with a graying beard and sharp, intelligent eyes, greeted them cautiously but without hostility. "Chaske," he said in French-accented English, clasping the warrior's hand warmly. "It has been many months. What brings you here in such dangerous times?" Chaske explained quickly, and Evangeline showed him the ledgers. Dr. Laurent's expression darkened as he examined them, his finger tracing the columns of damning numbers. "Mon Dieu," he whispered. "I knew Kensington was corrupt, but this—" He looked at Evangeline with new respect. "You are very brave, mademoiselle, to carry this evidence. Very brave and very much in danger. Can you help us reach the federal marshal in Yankton?" Evangeline asked. Laurent nodded slowly. "I can do better than that. I will ride to Fort Pierre and alert the territorial governor's office directly. With these ledgers as evidence, they will have no choice but to issue an arrest warrant immediately." He paused. "But you must stay hidden until I return. Kensington has many allies, men. He has bribed men who profit from his schemes. You cannot trust the army at Fort Randall. Some of the officers there are in his pocket." "How long will you need?" Chask asked. 4 days, perhaps 5 if the weather turns." Laurent began packing his medical supplies with practiced efficiency, rolling bandages and stowing bottles of laudanum and quinine. "There is an old trapper's cabin 2 miles west of here, abandoned but still sound. Hide there. I will send word when it is safe." Evangeline felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. "Thank you, Doctor." Laurent smiled grimly. "Thank me when this is over, mademoiselle. For now, go quickly and stay alive." They found the cabin by mid-morning, a low-roofed structure of weathered logs. Its single window shuttered its door, hanging slightly crooked on leather hinges. But it was dry defensible, and blessedly warm once Tashunka got a fire going in the stone hearth. Evangeline sank onto a rough wooden bench, exhaustion crashing over her. Chaske posted Hinto as a lookout outside and then sat down beside her, checking his rifle, methodically opening the breech, examining the rifling, ensuring the percussion cap was seated properly. "We should rest while we can," he said. Evangeline nodded, but sleep felt impossible. Her mind kept turning over everything that had happened, everything that could still go wrong. They were so close now, but close meant nothing if Kensington found them first. Chaske must have sensed her unease, because he said quietly, "You did well on the trail. Many would have given up." "I can't give up," Evangeline said. "Not when we're this close." "Close to justice," Chaske agreed. "Or close to death. Sometimes it is hard to tell the difference." Evangeline looked at him, really looked at him, the weariness in his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way his hands never stopped moving, always checking, always ready. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "You could have sent me away from the camp. Let me take my chances alone." Chaske was silent for a long moment. Then, "Because you are trying to do the right thing. And because—" he hesitated. "Because my family deserves justice, and so do yours, these children you protect. We are not so different, you and I." "No," Evangeline said softly. "I suppose we're not." She reached out and placed her hand on his, a simple gesture, but one that carried weight. Chaske looked down at their hands and then back at her, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of connection that transcended words. Outside, the wind howled and the snow began to fall again. They remained in the cabin for 3 days, waiting for word from Dr. Laurent. During that time, Evangeline and Chaske grew closer. They spoke of their pasts, their regrets, their hopes for a future beyond this nightmare. Chaske taught her a few words in Lakota Washte Good Thaku Yepi family, Wo We Chakiye help. She in turn read to him from one of the ledgers, showing him how to recognize English words and numbers, how the letters formed sounds and meanings. "If we survive this," Chaske said one evening, the firelight casting shadows across his face, "I would like to learn to read properly, so I can understand the white man's papers and treaties, so my people are never cheated again." "I'll teach you," Evangeline promised, and found herself meaning it deeply. "When this is over, I'll teach you everything I know." She meant it. More than that, she found herself imagining a future where such a thing might be possible, where they were not fugitives, where the children were safe, where she and Chaske could simply exist, perhaps build something together. It was a dangerous thought, and she tried to push it away. But it lingered warm, and persistent. On the third night, Tashunka returned from scouting with grim news. Kensington's men had found the cave. Chenoa and the children had escaped into the hills just in time, but the posse was now sweeping the area, methodically searching every possible hiding place. "It is only a matter of time before they find us." Chaske said, his voice tight. "We need to move again," Evangeline said, already gathering their supplies. "But where?" Before anyone could answer, Hinto entered the cabin, shaking snow from his coat. He had been on watch outside, and his cheeks were red from cold. "No riders," he reported in halting English. "All quiet." Chaske nodded, but his eyes were troubled. "Good. We will leave at first light." He stopped abruptly, his gaze narrowing. Evangeline followed his eyes and felt her heart skip. Chaske's powder horn, the one he'd hung carefully on a peg near the door when they arrived, was dripping. Not melted snow, but something else. Water seeping from the seams. Chaske moved with sudden, terrifying speed, grabbing the horn and uncorking it. He poured some of the contents into his palm, and his face went stone cold. The gunpowder was wet, completely soaked through. "What?" Evangeline began, but Chaske was already moving, checking Tashunka's powder horn, also wet. Their backup supply in the leather pouch, soaked. Someone had deliberately poured water into their gunpowder stores while they slept. Chaske spun toward Hinto, and the young man's face went white. Before he could run, Chaske had him by the collar, slamming him against the wall with enough force to rattle the entire cabin. "What did you do?" Chaske demanded in Lakota, then switched to English for Evangeline's benefit. "What have you done?" Hinto stammered something, his eyes wide with fear, and then words began tumbling out, first in Lakota, then broken English. "I had no choice, Kensington. He has my sister. He took her last summer, said she would work in his household. But he keeps her locked up. He said he would kill her if I did not help him." Tears streamed down his face. "I sent signals. I told him where we were going. He choked. I ruined the powder so you could not fight when they come. They are coming now. They will be here soon." "How soon?" Chaske's voice was deadly quiet. "They were 2 miles behind me when I left to scout." Hinto whispered, "I am sorry. I am so sorry. But my sister—" He never finished the sentence. The door burst open with explosive force torn from its hinges. 4 men poured into the cabin, revolvers drawn and cocked. Behind them, framed in the doorway, with the late afternoon light behind him, stood Silas Kensington himself. He was a broad, florid man in his 40s, dressed in an expensive fur coat and polished boots that must have cost more than a family's yearly wages. His face was red from cold and exertion, his eyes small and piggish above a bulbous nose. When he saw Evangeline, he smiled, a cold, triumphant expression that made her skin crawl. "Miss Rose," he said pleasantly, his voice cultured and smooth. "How good to finally catch up with you." Chaske lunged for his rifle, but one of the gunmen, faster expecting it, clubbed him across the temple with a revolver. Chaske went down hard, blood streaming from a gash in his scalp, his body going limp. "Chaske!" Evangeline screamed, moving toward him. But rough hands grabbed her arms and dragged her back with bruising force. Kensington stepped into the cabin, his eyes scanning the room with the satisfied air of a man who had finally cornered his prey. His gaze landed on the leather satchel sitting beside the fire. "Ah," he said softly. "There they are." He crossed to the satchel and picked it up, flipping through the ledgers with an almost casual air, as if reviewing pleasant memories rather than evidence of mass murder. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble, Miss Rose. Do you have any idea how much money I've spent hunting you? Nearly $2,000. That's more than most of these savages will earn in their entire lives. You're a murderer. Evangeline spat, struggling against the hands holding her. A thief and a murderer. And when the territorial governor sees those ledgers... The territorial governor, Kensington interrupted pleasantly, is a personal friend of mine. We play cards every Thursday, as is the federal marshal in Yankton, as are a great many people whose careers depend on looking the other way. He smiled, showing yellowed teeth. Did you really think you could bring me down with a few pages of numbers? Evangeline's heart sank, but she forced defiance into her voice. You can't hide this forever. Someone will listen. Perhaps, Kensington conceded with a shrug. But you won't be alive to see it. Neither will your Indian friends here. He gestured dismissively to one of his men. Tie them up, all of them. We'll deal with them once we're back at the agency. I'm thinking a tragic fire. These savages are so careless with their campfires. As the gunmen moved forward with rope, Evangeline caught Hinto's eye. The young man looked utterly broken, his face a mask of shame and terror and crushing guilt. I'm sorry, he whispered again, his voice breaking. I am so sorry. Evangeline wanted to scream at him, to curse him for his betrayal. But looking at his tear-streaked face, she could only feel a crushing sadness. Kensington had broken them all. They were bound with rough hemp rope and forced onto horses, their hands tied to the saddle horn so tightly that Evangeline's fingers quickly went numb. Chaske was barely conscious, blood still seeping from the wound on his head, staining his shirt collar dark red. Evangeline's wrists burned where the rope bit into her skin, but she forced herself to stay alert, searching for any chance of escape. Kensington led the procession personally, the leather satchel slung over his shoulder like a trophy, whistling a cheerful tune. His men, 8 of them, now armed with revolvers and Sharp's rifles, flanked them on all sides, their eyes constantly scanning the tree line. They rode east toward a range of low pine-covered hills. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Evangeline saw smoke rising in the distance and realized with a jolt Kensington's main camp. But before they reached it, one of the scouts rode back with urgent news. He spoke to Kensington in low, rapid tones, and the agent's expression darkened. Damn it, Kensington muttered. He turned to one of his lieutenants, a scarred man with dead eyes. Circle back and check the southern ridge. If those Indians are still tracking us, I want to know about it. He didn't finish the thought, but the implication was clear. Chenoa and the others had not given up. Kensington changed direction, leading them into a narrow canyon. At its far end, half hidden by scrub brush and boulders, was the entrance to an old mine shaft, abandoned by the look of it, but still accessible. Rusted equipment lay scattered nearby, a broken sluice, a collapsed wheelbarrow. We'll hole up here until nightfall, Kensington announced. Then we move the prisoners to the agency under cover of darkness. No witnesses that way. He gestured to Hinto, who had been riding silently behind them, his head bowed in shame. You inside. Make yourself useful for once. Hinto dismounted shakily and led the horses into the mine entrance, which opened into a larger chamber supported by rotting timber beams. Evangeline and Chaske were hauled off their horses and shoved inside, forced to sit against the cold rock wall. The temperature inside the mine was brutally cold, the kind of cold that seeped into bones. Chaske's eyes were clearer now, though a nasty bruise was forming on his temple, and his left eye was swollen nearly shut. He glanced at Evangeline, and she saw a flicker of determination in his gaze. Not over yet, his expression seemed to say. Kensington posted guards at the mine entrance, and then turned his attention to the ledgers, flipping through them by lantern light. Occasionally, he would chuckle a low, ugly sound that made Evangeline's skin crawl. You know, he said conversationally, not looking up. I'm almost impressed, Miss Rose. Most people don't have the spine to run. They just accept the way things are, the natural order of the world. He looked up at her. But you actually thought you could change something. How quaint, how very feminine in its naivety. People like you always underestimate people like me, Evangeline said coldly. Until it's too late. Kensington laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. Bold words for a woman tied up in a mine shaft, awaiting execution. Tell me, what exactly do you think is going to happen now? Do you imagine some dramatic rescue? Evangeline said nothing, but her mind was racing. She tested her bond, surreptitiously tight, expertly tied, but not impossible. If she could just get her hands free. Beside her, Chasky shifted slightly, and she felt something press against her hip. She glanced down and saw it, a small knife, somehow concealed in his boot, and now worked partially free. He must have been working on it, since they were tied up, using the horse's movement to gradually loosen it. Hope flared in her chest like a struck match. But before they could act, one of the guards at the entrance called out in alarm, riders approaching, multiple contacts from the north. Kensington swore viciously and strode to the entrance, peering out into the gathering dusk. How many? At least a dozen, the guard reported, his voice tight. Indians on foot and horseback. They've got us surrounded. Kensington's face twisted with rage, his earlier calm evaporating. Of course they do. Persistent bastards. He turned to his men, drawing a revolver from his coat. Defensive positions. If they want to fight, we'll give them one they won't forget. Shoot anything that moves. Chaos erupted. Gunmen rushed to barricade the mine entrance with crates and barrels, training their rifles on the canyon outside. Kensington himself checked his revolver's cylinder, his hands shaking slightly, whether from cold or rage Evangeline couldn't tell. And in the confusion, Evangeline saw her chance. She nudged Chaska urgently with her shoulder. He nodded fractionally and passed the knife into her bound hands, the movement covered by the commotion. She twisted her wrists painfully, sawing at the ropes with the tiny blade. It was agonizingly slow work, the rope fibers thick and resistant. But finally, they parted with a soft snap. Her hands came free. Pins and needles shot through her fingers as blood flow returned. She quickly cut Chaska's bonds, and they exchanged a brief, intense look that communicated volumes. Then, as the first gunshots rang out from the canyon, the sharp crack of Sharp's rifles answered by older muskets, they moved. Chasky lunged for the nearest guard, striking him hard across the jaw with a precise blow that dropped the man like a felled tree. He seized the guard's rifle before the man hit the ground, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. Evangeline grabbed a fallen revolver, her hands shaking, but her resolve firm. The weapon was heavier than she expected, cold and deadly in her grip. Outside, the canyon echoed with gunfire and war cries. Chenoa's band had launched a full assault, drawing Kensington's men into a desperate firefight. The acrid smell of black powder smoke drifted into the mine, burning Evangeline's eyes and throat. Kensington himself spun around, his eyes widening as he saw them free. No! Chaske raised the rifle, but before he could fire, Hinto, who had been cowering near the back of the mine among the old equipment, suddenly lunged forward with a desperate cry that was half sob, half scream. Not at Evangeline or Chaske, at Kensington. You lied! Hinto screamed, his voice raw with grief and rage and terrible understanding. I read the ledgers while you slept. I saw the names. You sold my sister to a brothel in Yankton. She was never in your house. You sold her, and all the others, you killed them all. He crashed into Kensington with the full force of his body, and the two men went down in a tangle of limbs. Kensington's revolver discharged with a deafening crack. In the confined space, the bullet ricocheting off the mine walls with a whining sound, striking sparks from the rock. Chasky grabbed Evangeline's arm. "We have to go now before they regroup." They ran deeper into the mine, away from the fighting. The tunnel branched ahead, barely visible in the darkness. Chasky chose the left fork without hesitation, his steps sure despite the near-total darkness. "You know this place." Evangeline gasped, her heart hammering. "We used to play here as boys," Chasky said grimly, "before the miners abandoned it. There is another exit if it has not collapsed." Behind them they heard shouts and the pounding of boots. Kensington's men were giving chase, their lantern light casting wild shadows. They ran through the darkness, Evangeline's hand gripping Chasky's coat to keep from losing him. The tunnel narrowed, the ceiling lowering until they had to duck the support beams, groaning ominously. Then ahead she saw a sliver of gray daylight, pale and precious. They burst out of the mine's back exit onto a hillside covered in snow and scattered pines. Below them, perhaps 200 yards distant, the Ash River wound through the valley, its surface glittering with ice that caught the dying light like shattered glass. There, Chasky pointed to a copse of trees where several horses were tethered, Chenoa's mounts left as a contingency. They ran down the slope, their boots slipping on the snow legs, burning with effort. Behind them, 3 of Kensington's men emerged from the mine, raising their rifles. Bullets whined through the air. One struck a tree trunk inches from Evangeline's head, spraying bark and splinters that cut her cheek. She stumbled, but kept running. And then, impossibly, a familiar voice rang out across the valley, clear and authoritative. "Federal Marshal, drop your weapons immediately." Evangeline skidded to a halt, her eyes going wide. Dr. Laurent rode into view at the head of a small column of mounted men, but it wasn't the doctor wearing the badge. Beside Laurent, a tall man in a dark coat sat astride a bay horse, his hand resting on a holstered Colt revolver. A silver badge glinted on his chest, catching the last rays of sunlight. The federal marshal had arrived. Behind him rode a dozen deputized men, their rifles trained on Kensington's gunmen with professional precision. The men from the mine hesitated, looking at each other, and then one by one lowered their weapons. They were hired guns, not fanatics. They knew when they were beaten. For a moment, everything seemed frozen, a tableau of exhausted combatants and wary lawmen suspended in the cold mountain air. The only sound was the distant grinding of ice on the river and the labored breathing of tired men and horses. Then Silas Kensington burst from the mine entrance, wild-eyed and bloodied. His expensive coat was torn, his face smeared with dirt and blood, whether his own or Hinto's. Evangeline couldn't tell. In one hand he clutched the leather satchel, in the other a cocked revolver that he waved erratically. "Stay back," he roared, his voice hoarse and cracking. "I'll burn these ledgers, I swear to God, I'll burn them all right here." The marshal, a lean, hard-faced man in his 40s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years on the frontier, raised a hand signaling his men to hold. "Mr. Kensington," he said calmly, his voice carrying across the canyon. "You are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy to commit murder, and the unlawful sale and kidnapping of children. Put down the weapon." "Arrest!" Kensington laughed, a jagged, unhinged sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "On whose authority? Those ledgers are government property. You have no right." "Dr. Laurent has already testified before the territorial governor." The marshal interrupted, his tone still calm, but with steel underneath. "Your crimes are known. Your business partners in Yankton have been arrested. Your accounts have been seized. This is over, Kensington." Kensington's face twisted with rage and desperation, the mask of civility finally shattering completely. He took a step back, then another, edging toward the canyon rim, where the ground sloped down toward the river. "If I go down," he snarled, spittle flying from his lips, "I'm taking you all with me." He raised the revolver, aiming not at the marshal, but at Evangeline. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to that dark barrel pointed at her heart. Evangeline saw the hatred in Kensington's eyes, saw his finger beginning to tighten on the trigger. She tried to move, but her body felt sluggish, frozen. And then Chasky was there, stepping between her and the gun with fluid grace. The revolver fired. The shot cracked across the canyon, a sharp report that sent birds exploding from nearby trees. The bullet struck Chaska high in the chest, spinning him around. He staggered, blood spreading across his shirt in a rapidly widening stain, and collapsed into the snow. "No!" Evangeline screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands immediately going to the wound. "Chaske, no, no, no." Blood pulsed between her fingers, hot and terrifying. Chaske's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with shock. Kensington turned and ran sprinting toward the river with surprising speed for a man of his bulk. The marshal's men opened fire, but Kensington dodged and weaved, using boulders for cover. He reached the riverbank and plunged down the steep embankment, half sliding, half falling toward the ice-covered water, below the heavy satchel still clutched to his chest. Evangeline pressed her hands to Chaske's chest, trying desperately to staunch the bleeding. "Stay with me," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Chaske, stay with me. Don't leave me. Don't you dare leave me." Dr. Laurent was suddenly there, dropping to his knees beside them, his medical bag already open. "Let me work, mademoiselle," he said gently but firmly. Evangeline moved aside, her hands slick with blood, and looked toward the river. Through her tears, she could see Kensington reaching the ice. The Ash River stretched wide here, perhaps 60 yards across. The ice was thick near the banks, but treacherous toward the center, where the current ran swift and deadly beneath a deceptively smooth surface. Kensington stepped onto the ice, gingerly testing its strength. It held. He took another step, then another, moving carefully toward the far bank. The marshal and his men lined the riverbank, rifles raised, but none of them fired. The marshal called out, "Kensington, stop, the ice won't hold you in the center." But Kensington either didn't hear or didn't care. He laughed, a wild, manic sound that carried across the water, and kept walking, the satchel clutched to his chest like a shield. "All these years," he shouted back, his voice carrying, "all these years I've built this empire. You think you can take it from me. You think some numbers in a ledger matter. I am indispensable. The territory needs men like me." He was a quarter of the way across now, moving with growing confidence. Chaske, despite his wound, despite the blood soaking his shirt, managed to speak. His voice was weak but clear. "Evangeline." She turned back to him, gripping his hand. "I'm here. I'm right here." "The ice," he gasped. "Center, thin. Current runs fast there, always has." His eyes found hers, urgent despite his fading strength. "Stop him. Can't let him escape with ledgers." Evangeline looked back at the river, her mind racing. Kensington was halfway across now, and the ice was holding. No. Wait. She could see cracks beginning to form, spider-webbing outward from his boots with each step. The satchel he carried was heavy, not just with ledgers, but with something else. She remembered from her examination of the book's records of gold payments, bribes in coin and dust. Kensington had grabbed not just evidence, but his emergency fund. The weight of his greed pulling him down. "Marshal," Evangeline called out. "Fire a warning shot in front of him on the ice." The marshal hesitated for just a moment, then understood. He raised his rifle, aimed carefully, and fired. The Sharp's rifle's report was deafening. The bullet struck the ice 10 feet in front of Kensington, punching through with a crack that echoed across the valley. Kensington jerked to a stop, his arms windmilling for balance. The ice around the bullet hole spider-webbed with new cracks, spreading rapidly. "Don't move," the marshal shouted. "Stay still, and we'll get a rope to you. Come." But Kensington, panicking now, made a fatal choice. Instead of staying still, instead of dropping the heavy satchel to distribute his weight more evenly, he clutched it tighter and tried to run. 3 steps. That was all he managed. With a sound like a cannon shot, the ice gave way beneath him. Kensington plunged into the black water with a scream that was cut off abruptly as the current seized him. The shock of the cold water so frigid, it felt like knives drove the air from his lungs. He flailed, gasping, his heavy coat and boots pulling him under. The satchel flew from his hands, skittering across an intact section of ice before tumbling into the water. "Help!" He choked, his voice suddenly small and human and terrified. "Help me, I can't." The current was too strong. It dragged him downstream under the ice, then pulled him back up 15 yards away. His face was already blue, his movements growing sluggish. One of the marshal's men started to move toward the water, but the marshal held up a hand. "You'll die too. The current is too strong." They watched as Kensington struggled weakly, his fingers scrabbling at the ice edge, unable to find purchase. His expensive coat, now waterlogged, weighed him down like an anchor. Evangeline looked back at Chaske, torn. Part of her, a small dark part she didn't want to acknowledge, whispered that Kensington deserved this. That justice in its own way had finally come. But she couldn't just watch a man die. "Isn't there anything we can do?" she asked Dr. Laurent desperately. The doctor's face was grave. "By the time we fashion a rope long enough and secure enough, he will already be gone. The cold water. No one survives more than a few minutes." Evangeline looked back at the river. Kensington had stopped struggling now, his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. The cold was taking him, shutting down his body piece by piece. "The ledgers," one of the deputies said urgently. "If they're lost, there." Another deputy pointed. The leather satchel had caught on a jagged piece of ice near the far bank, its straps tangled in the frozen branches of a submerged tree. One of the marshal's men, a young deputy who clearly knew the river, immediately began making his way carefully along the bank, to a point where he could reach it with a long branch. By the time they looked back at the river, Kensington had vanished beneath the dark water. The current carried his body downstream toward deeper, colder reaches, where the ice grew thick and the light never penetrated. Silas Kensington was gone. The deputy successfully retrieved the satchel, water streaming from it as he carried it carefully back to shore. The marshal opened it immediately, examining the ledgers. "Waterlogged?" he said grimly, "but readable. The ink is iron gall, it won't run." He looked at Evangeline with something like respect. "This evidence will hold up in court." Evangeline nodded numbly, then turned back to Chaske. He was still alive, but barely. Dr. Laurent was working frantically, packing the wound with cloth torn from his own shirt and muttering in French. "How is he?" Evangeline asked, her voice shaking, her hands still stained with his blood. Laurent didn't look up, his hands moving with practiced precision. "The bullet missed his heart, but it may have clipped a lung. He has lost much blood, too much." He glanced at her, his expression grave. "He needs rest, warmth, and prayer. In that order. And even then." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Chaske's eyes opened, finding hers with effort. He tried to speak, but only a wet, rasping sound emerged, followed by a trickle of blood from the corner of his mouth. "Don't talk." Evangeline said, gripping his hand with both of hers, trying to will warmth and life into him. You're going to be fine. Do you hear me? You're going to be fine. She wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. Around them, the marshal's men were rounding up Kensington's hired guns, binding them with rope and confiscating their weapons. The sounds of the canyon grew quiet, the battle over. Chaske squeezed her hand weakly, his lips moving to form silent words she couldn't quite read. Save your strength, Evangeline whispered, leaning close. Please, just hold on. And as the sun set over the Ash River, painting the ice in shades of crimson and gold, Evangeline held Chaske's hand and prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. She prayed that mercy existed somewhere in this brutal world, that justice once served might bring peace, that the man who had saved her life would live to see the future they had both fought for. Chaske survived. It was a near thing, a desperately near thing. For 5 days, he lay in a fevered delirium in Dr. Laurent's tent, while the physician worked tirelessly to keep infection at bay. Evangeline rarely left his side, changing bandages soaked through with blood and fluid, spooning broth between his lips when he could swallow, and whispering stories to him in the long, dark hours of the night. Stories of the school they would build, of children learning together, of a future worth surviving for. On the 6th day, his fever broke. He opened his eyes clear and aware for the first time and saw her sitting beside him, her own face gaunt with exhaustion. You stayed, he said, his voice rough but steady. Of course I stayed, Evangeline said, relief flooding through her so powerfully she had to blink back tears. Where else would I go? A faint smile touched his lips. I thought, when that gun fired, I thought I had lost you. You saved my life, Evangeline said quietly, taking his hand. Again, Chaske shook his head slightly, wincing at the movement. No, you saved mine first, on the river in the cave. Every moment since we met, you have given me a reason to keep fighting. His fingers intertwined with hers. Pila mayaye, Evangeline. Thank you. Tears stung her eyes. We saved each other, she said. That's how it works. Yes, he agreed softly. That is how it works. The federal marshal, true to his word, had rounded up Kensington's remaining men and retrieved the children from the hills. Chenoa and the rest of the Lakota band were unharmed, though grieving for Mado, and another warrior killed in the fighting men with families with children who would grow up without fathers. Hinto, the betrayer, had survived the mine collapse. He had fought Kensington with desperate fury, and while he hadn't killed the agent, he had given Evangeline and Chaske the precious seconds needed to escape. The council debated his fate for a long time. Voices raised in anger and grief. Some called for execution, others for exile. Chenoa finally spoke her voice, carrying the weight of years and wisdom. He is broken, she said. His sister is gone, sold into a fate worse than death. His honor is destroyed. He will carry that brokenness and shame for the rest of his life. That is punishment enough. In the end, the council chose exile. Hinto left the band with nothing but the clothes on his back and a horse riding south toward an uncertain future. Before he left, he approached Evangeline, his eyes red from crying. I cannot ask for forgiveness, he said in halting English. But I want you to know my last act was true. When I understood what he did to my sister, I knew I had to stop him, even if it cost my life. I know, Evangeline said quietly. That doesn't erase what you did. But it matters. Hinto nodded once, then rode away. She never saw him again. The trial took place in Yankton in the territorial courthouse, a modest building of whitewashed wood with a steep roof to shed the winter snows. The courtroom was packed with spectators, settlers, Lakota representatives, Journalists from as far away as St. Louis and Chicago, all eager to witness what the newspapers were calling the Indian Agency scandal. Since Kensington was dead, the trial focused on his co-conspirators and the establishment of an official record of his crimes. 4 of his business partners in Yankton were charged as accessories. The trial lasted 3 days. Evangeline sat in the witness stand, the ledgers laid out on the table before her, and testified for nearly 4 hours. She detailed Kensington's schemes in careful, methodical fashion, his theft of ration funds, his dilution of medicines, his selling and shipping of children-like property. She read from the pages in a clear, steady voice, letting the numbers speak for themselves. When she finished, the judge, a stern, gray-haired man named Hiram Black, nodded gravely. "Thank you, Miss Rose. Your courage in bringing this evidence forward at great personal risk is commendable and will not be forgotten." Then it was Chaska's turn. He walked to the stand, slowly, still recovering from his wound, one hand pressed to his side. But when he began to speak, his voice was strong and clear, carrying to every corner of the crowded courtroom. "Indian Agent Kensington promised my people vaccine against smallpox," he said in English, speaking carefully to ensure everyone understood. "He charged us dearly for it. 20 horses, all our furs from the autumn hunt, everything we had of value. He said it would protect us, that the great Father in Washington sent it to save Indian children." He paused, and the courtroom was utterly silent. "When smallpox came, my wife Niaha received this medicine. My daughter Winona, who was 7 winters old, received it. My son Chetan, who was only 2 winters old, received it." His voice did not waver, but Evangeline saw the grief etched in every line of his face. "They all died screaming in fever and pain, while their skin erupted in sores. Their bodies burned with fire. I could not save them. I held them while they died." Several women in the courtroom were crying now. Even the judge's expression had softened. Later, a doctor, a good man, Dr. Laurent, told me the truth. The vaccine had been diluted, cut with water and colored dye to look real. It was worthless. My family died because Silas Kensington wanted to save $340. Chasky's hand trembled slightly as he pulled out a piece of paper, one of the ledger pages, carefully preserved. In his book, Agent Kensington wrote that our deaths were acceptable losses. Our lives meant nothing to him. We were just numbers in his ledger problems, to be managed, profits to be made. He looked directly at the judge, and then at the jury, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "We are not numbers. We are people. We have families, we love our children, we mourn our dead. We deserve justice the same as any white man, the same as your families." When Chasky stepped down, the courtroom remained silent for a long moment. Then slowly, one person began to applaud, then another. Soon, half the courtroom was applauding an unprecedented breach of courtroom decorum that Judge Black made no move to stop. Then the children stood. Mary Thomas and the other 3 orphans, dressed in clean clothes provided by a local church. They had been sitting in the front row, and now they rose one by one. Mary spoke, her young voice clear and brave, despite her trembling. "Agent Kensington told us we were going to good homes to families who wanted us. But he sold us. He took money from men who wanted workers for their farms and mines, and he sold us like we were horses or cattle." Thomas, the youngest, added in a small but determined voice, "He hurt us, and he was going to hurt more children. Miss Rose saved us. She and Mr. Chaske, they saved us when no one else would." Judge Black looked at the children, at the ledgers, at the packed courtroom, and nodded slowly. "The court finds the evidence compelling and irrefutable." He said, his voice heavy with the weight of justice. Were Silas Kensington alive to stand trial, he would face the hangman's noose for his crimes against both the Indian tribes under his care and the orphan children entrusted to his agency. He paused, letting the words settle. As it stands, this court orders the seizure of all his assets and properties to be distributed as restitution to his victims. Furthermore, I am recommending a full federal investigation into both the Orphan Train Society placement practices and the entire Indian agency system across the Dakota Territory. He brought his gavel down with a sharp crack. This court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and scattered applause. Evangeline felt tears slip down her cheeks, tears of relief, exhaustion, and something that felt almost like hope. It wasn't perfect. Kensington himself had escaped justice by dying in that river. His business partners would serve prison sentences, but not the one he deserved. The system that had enabled him still existed would take years to truly reform. But his victims, the living ones at least, would receive some measure of recompense. The truth was now official record. The children would be protected. It was more than she had dared to hope for. After the trial, Chask and Evangeline stood together outside the courthouse, watching the sun set over the wide Dakota plains. The winter was finally beginning to loosen its grip, and there was a hint of warmth in the air, a promise of spring. "What will you do now?" Chask asked. Evangeline had been thinking about this question for days. The Orphan Train Society had dismissed her. Of course, she was too much of a liability, too associated with scandal. But she found she didn't care. "Dr. Laurent left me something in his will," she said quietly. The doctor had died a week after the trial, his old heart finally giving out after the stress and exertion. But before he passed, he had drawn up a will. Leaving Evangeline a small plot of land he had homesteaded near the Ash River, a piece of ground, both settlers, and Lakota already used as a place to meet and trade and funds to establish a school. A school for everyone. Evangeline continued, her voice growing stronger. White children, Lakota children, orphans, anyone who wants to learn. A place where what happened to Kensington's victims can never happen again, because children will know how to read contracts, understand numbers, recognize when they're being cheated. She hesitated, then looked at Chasky. I thought maybe you could help me build it." Chasky's expression softened, his dark eyes holding hers. "You would stay in the territory, if you'll have me." Evangeline's voice was steady, but her heart pounded. "I know it won't be easy. People will talk, they'll judge a white woman living among the Lakota teaching together. Let them talk," Chaske said simply, his voice firm. He took her hand, his grip warm and sure and real. "You are brave," Evangeline rose. "Braver than any warrior I have known. And if you wish to build a school to teach our children, yours and mine, white and Lakota together, then I will help you. We will build it together." Evangeline felt warmth bloom in her chest, a fragile, precious thing, but real and growing. "Together," she echoed. They stood there as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and deep purple. The wind carried the scent of pine and the first hint of prairie grass beginning to green. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried, not a sound of hunting or warning, but simply of existence. It was not an ending. Not really. It was a beginning. Part 10. Resolution: The School on Ash River, 1 year later. The school stood on a gentle rise overlooking the Ash River, a sturdy building of fresh-cut logs, with a steep shingle roof and wide windows to let in the light. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and the sound of children's laughter drifted on the wind, a sound that had been rare in this valley for too many years. Inside, Evangeline stood before a classroom of 23 children, some white, some Lakota, some of mixed heritage, some orphans from the orphan train, now permanently placed with caring families. They sat on rough-hewn benches, their faces turned attentively toward the blackboard where she was teaching them arithmetic. "Very good, Thomas," she said, smiling as the youngest boy successfully solved a problem, his tongue poking out in concentration. "Now, who can tell me what 6 times 7 equals?" Mary's hand shot up along with several others. 42, Miss Rose." "Excellent." Evangeline wrote the number on the board, then glanced out the window. Chaske was there working with a group of older boys to repair the school's front steps, which had buckled slightly during the spring thaw. He had healed well from his wound, though he still moved carefully on cold mornings and sometimes pressed his hand to his chest when he thought no one was watching. His hair was longer now, tied back with a strip of leather, and he wore a mix of Lakota and settler clothing buckskin trousers with a cotton shirt, moccasins, and a wide-brimmed hat. A pragmatic compromise for their new life. He caught her looking and smiled, a rare, genuine expression that still made her heart skip. A knock at the door interrupted the lesson. Evangeline opened it to find Chenoa standing there, her arms full of woven blankets in beautiful geometric patterns. "For the children," the elder woman said warmly in improved English. She'd been attending the evening classes Evangeline held for adults. "Winter is coming again, and they will need to stay warm." "Thank you, Chenoa," Evangeline said, taking the blankets gratefully. "You're too generous." "Nonsense." Chenoa's eyes twinkled. "Besides, I like seeing them learn. My granddaughter says you have been teaching her to read English. She read me a letter from a missionary in Yankton, all by herself. She is very proud." Evangeline felt a swell of satisfaction. The school was everything she had hoped for, a place where children from all backgrounds could learn together, where the divisions of race and culture could perhaps begin to heal. It was slow work. There were still settlers who refused to send their children, still Lakota families who distrusted anything associated with white education. The territorial government provided minimal support, and they relied heavily on private donations and the small stipend from Dr. Laurent's estate. But progress was being made, one student at a time. That evening, after the children had gone home, Evangeline and Chaske sat together on the school's front porch, watching the sun set over the river. The Ash River, the place where Kensington had met his end, where justice had been served, not by the hand of man, but by the implacable laws of a nature. "We received a letter today," Chaske said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat. "From the territorial governor's office." Evangeline took it, her heart skipping nervously. But as she read, relief washed over her. The letter confirmed that the inquiry into the Orphan Train Society had led the governor to order changes. Riders had been appointed to inspect orphan placements and agency accounts, and several corrupt agents had been dismissed from their posts. 2 of Kensington's business partners were serving 10-year sentences in territorial prison. It was not a perfect system, far from it, but it was better. "They're also formally recognizing this school," Evangeline said, reading further. "We'll receive a small stipend from the Territorial Education Fund for supplies, and a visiting teacher from Yankton will come twice a month to help with advanced subjects." Chaske smiled. "That is good news." "Yes," Evangeline agreed. She folded the letter carefully and looked at him. "We did it, Chaske. We actually did it." "You did it," he corrected gently. "I only helped." "No," Evangeline said firmly, reaching for his hand. "We did it together. Every step of the way. From that first night in the blizzard to today together." Chaske took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that had become familiar and precious. "Then we will continue together. For as long as you wish." Evangeline felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears born of relief and hope, and something deeper that she had finally allowed herself to name. "For as long as I wish," she said softly. "That might be a very long time, Chaske." Good, he said simply. They sat in companionable silence as the stars began to appear overhead, one by one, like promises written in the night sky. The same sky that had witnessed Kensington's greed pull him down into dark water. The same sky that had watched them flee through blizzards and fight for their lives. The same sky that would watch over the children now learning inside these walls. After a long while, Chaske spoke quietly. Do you ever think about that day on the river? Evangeline knew immediately what he meant. Sometimes. I watched him fall through the ice. Chaske said, his voice thoughtful rather than triumphant. I watched him struggle and drown, and I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no joy. Only, he paused, searching for the word. Completion, as if a circle had closed. Justice, Evangeline said softly, but not the kind we expected. No, Chaske agreed. Not the justice of courts and laws. Something older. The justice of rivers and ice of greed that weighs a man down until he sinks. He could have dropped that satchel. Could have saved himself. But he couldn't let go. Evangeline finished. The weight of what he'd stolen, all those lives, all that gold, pulled him under. They both fell silent, contemplating that moment. It had haunted Evangeline's dreams at first, Kensington's terrified face disappearing beneath the black water, the awful sound of his last scream. But slowly the nightmares had faded, replaced by a strange sense of peace. Nature had rendered its verdict where human law might have faltered. The ledgers survived, Chaske said. The evidence survived. That is what mattered. Yes, Evangeline agreed. And because of those ledgers, because of everything we endured, those children in there. She gestured to the school. They have a chance. A real chance. The ledgers had been archived in the territorial capital, a permanent record of Kensington's crimes. The children from the orphan train had been placed with carefully vetted families, or like Mary and Thomas had chosen to stay at the school as live-in students helping with younger children and continuing their education. Chenoa's band had received a small share of the seized funds paid out as compensation to widows and orphans. The question of their land was still officially under review, but no one now dared challenge their camps along the river. Other bands across the territory were beginning to demand similar accountings, similar justice. It wasn't perfect. The world was still full of injustice, cruelty, and pain. But here on this small piece of land beside the Ash River, something new was growing. A place where children could learn, where communities could come together, where the wounds of the past might slowly, painfully begin to heal. Evangeline looked at Chaske, at the school they had built with their own hands, and the help of both communities, at the vast Dakota sky stretching endlessly above them, and allowed herself to hope. Not for a perfect ending, but for a future worth fighting for. A future where children, all children, might read and write and understand the papers men asked them to sign. Where they could recognize injustice and demand change. Where the next Kensington would find it harder to hide his crimes. What are you thinking? Chaske asked softly. That Dr. Laurence would be proud, Evangeline said. That Winona and Shaitan and Niyaha, their deaths, weren't meaningless. This school exists because of them, because of what we learned from the ledgers. Because we refused to let Kensington destroy the evidence. Chaske nodded, his eyes distant. His eyes. I think of them every day. I teach these children, and I imagine Winona among them learning to read. It hurts, but it also helps. Yes, Evangeline said, understanding completely. It helps. They sat together as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars emerged, those same ancient lights that had guided travelers across these plains for for countless generations. Below them, the Ash River flowed on cold and dark and eternal, carrying its secrets toward the Missouri and beyond. Justice had been served, imperfect, painful, but real. Lives had been saved, and two people brought together by tragedy and bound by purpose had found something neither of them expected: a reason to stay, a place to belong, a home. In the distance, a wolf howled, not in threat, but in acknowledgement of the turning seasons. Winter would come again, as it always did. But so would spring. And in this school beside the river, in the laughter of children learning together, in the quiet partnership of two people who had survived the storm. And there was proof that even in the harshest landscape, even after the cruelest winter, new life could take root and grow. Evangeline Rose and Chasky had walked through fire and ice and blood. They had lost much, but they had also found each other, and in finding each other had discovered that hope was not a naive dream, but a deliberate choice, a choice to build, to teach, to believe that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the river sang its endless song, and they sat together on their porch and chose hope. Again and again. Together.